The Parliament of the Bahamas is formally made up of an appointed Senate and an elected House of Assembly. The structure, functions, and procedures of Parliament are based on the Westminster system, a system widely scrutinized and ridiculed for years. On September 29, 1729, 24 members representing the islands of New Providence, Eleuthera, and Harbor Island gathered together at the house of Samuel Lawford to form the Assembly, the first Parliament. In 1841, the Bahamian legislature took on more structure, with the Legislative Council being the superior legislative body and the House of Assembly being the lesser. The Legislative Council eventually was renamed to the Senate in 1964 and became the weaker house, while the House of Assembly became the superior legislative body. The Senate is, however, still known as the upper house and the House of Assembly as the lower house. Since then, so many things have happened in the House of Assembly, to include the tossing out of the mace by Lyndon Pindling. But of late, the House seems, in the opinion of many, to have lost its prestige, honor, and stature. Tonight, our discussion topic is parliamentary privilege. I'm your host, Kendeno Knowles, filling in for Jerome Sawyer. See you on the other side of the break.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back, and as said, our topic is parliamentary privilege. And our guests are former Speaker of the House of Assembly, Halson Moultrie, and former House of Assembly Clerk, Maurice Tynes. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The House of Assembly. Some people say we've seen a shift over the years from what many of us remember it to be. In particular, the behavior of some members. I want to begin this discussion with how you view that shift.
Asking me first?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, ever since we heralded political parties into the House of Assembly, it's been an adversarial system. One side proposes, the other side opposes. And, and depending on the politics at the time, you will have some more spirited disagreements and debate. No, yes, certainly. Yeah. I think that's all part of the parliamentary system and part of democracy.
And for you, former Speaker?
What has happened over the years, it appears to me as if some of the traditions and the conventions of the Westminster model of governance that were adhered to and really respected by some of our senior politicians dating back into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What I see now is a shift in the erosion of the system itself. I see the parliament, we have a parliamentary democracy, but over the years, we have evolved into what I consider to be an executive aristocracy. And I say that because over the years, the executive has grown so much so that the legislative branch has a major challenge in functioning as expected. It has three functions: a representative functions, it has a legislative function, and it has an oversight function.
And so break that down for the average viewer who may not clearly understand what that means.
Okay, for example, the Parliament of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas is the only, in the House of Assembly, is the only institution where every Bahamian is represented. They're not represented in the Senate, they're not represented in the executive branch, in the cabinet. The House of Assembly, the Parliament is the only place of representation for the people by the elected representatives. And then there's a legislative function where the Parliament is the only branch of the government that passes laws, amends laws, repeal laws, and puts taxes, increases or decreases taxes on the people. That's the legislative function. And then the oversight function under Article 72 of the Constitution is that the Parliament is the place where the executive branch must account to the people, representatives, on their stewardship as a cabinet. So we've seen the undermining of that, in my estimation, where the executive branch can enter the Parliament with more votes than the backbench and the opposition combined.
Mr. Tynes, I want to bring you in here. Do you see that vantage point as well, or are you seeing it from the same perspective as the former speaker?
Yes, I think what the former speaker is saying is that there are so many cabinet ministers, PAL secretaries in the House. There's no backbench, and so there's no opportunity for the Parliament to play its constitutional role in holding the government, the cabinet, to account. That certainly is an issue. But one of my problems with the Parliament of the Bahamas is that we're too slow to do reforms. You know, we were aware of this since the 80s. We have done nothing to change it. I know there have been several. I know there has been a constitutional review commission, and several other commissions that recommended that we try to we hold the number of cabinet ministers to I think it's 15. The last commission recommended no larger than 15. You know, the fundamental problem is that the Constitution puts a minimum number, but it doesn't put a maximum number of members in the House. And in the Bahamas, we have been having these swings in general elections where one party takes a large portion of the seats, and the other party, the opposition, is left with a small number. And I think that is a real democratic problem. And I think, but we are much too slow to do reforms.
And while that remains an issue, we've seen a number of issues as a result of the things that you've both pointed out. And one of the things that we've also seen is really, and I don't want to say this, I want to use the right words when I say this, we've seen really a diminishing almost of the positions held within the Parliament. A question most people want to know about one of those positions is, what is the ultimate powers of the House Speaker?
Well, the Speaker of the House has three main functions. He is the presiding officer, and that is the function where most people see him or see the position. He's also the spokesperson for the House of Assembly and in its dealings with other parliaments and other institutions. The Speaker, he would sign all the letters that come from the House of Assembly. And then the Speaker is the person who demands and enforces the privileges of the House and of the members. And so those have not changed from centuries. But I think the Bahamian public, what they see is the Speaker in his role as presiding officer. And I do agree that I don't think we put sufficient value in the office of Speaker. Some of the things that Mr. Moultrie clamored for while he was Speaker are real issues. But you know, they like I say, they still have not been addressed and addressed properly.
And even in your attempts, former Speaker, to bring light to those issues, you face some backlash for that as well, right?
Yes. Fundamentally, I believe there was a misconception of the separation of powers, in that there are three branches of the government. The first branch of the government is the legislative branch of the government, which is the Parliament. Then there's the executive branch of the government that is answerable to the Parliament. And the third branch of the government is the judiciary, which interprets the laws passed by the Parliament.
So let me ask you on that. The members, especially new ones just coming in, do you feel as if they're as knowledgeable as they should be, though, about rules, regulations, and function of the Parliament, which you begun to break down for us?
Well, I believe it is a learning process, particularly now with the changes that we see happening, because we are seeing every election now a number of new candidates being put forward by the major political parties. So it's very likely that the composition of the Parliament, of the House of Assembly that is, will have a number of new faces after every general election. And as a consequence of that, you would have persons coming into Parliament, and it's an on-the-job learning process. For example, the last three speakers of the Parliament were elected speakers on their very first day in Parliament, which is unusual, for example, in the House of Commons, where we adopt all of our traditions and our system.
So let me ask this. When are they trained? You pointed out about a number of new candidates that we've seen come to the halls of Parliament. When are they trained, though, on parliamentary etiquette? And do you think this training should begin once they are nominated to run? So
Well,
when are they trained? And
when you are elected, I know my experience has been when we got elected, there was a session for about a week where all parliamentarians, even the senior ones or the returning parliamentarians, would attend, and we are taken through a training process. But of course, it is not simulated like a real process. So you don't have the challenge when you get up to speak. You don't have the challenge of the resistance and the adversarial approach of the opposition or the government, a government member, challenging on a point of order or interrupting your speeches and so on. So what I tried to do initially when I became the speaker is I said, okay, The Constitution under Article 55 gives us the power to regulate ourselves, and in regulating ourselves, we have produced a book of rules and procedures. We're going to function according to these rules of procedure.
And that said, let me ask this. Have you had any reason to feel that any member, and Mr. Tynes, you can chime in here as well, have you felt any member by his or her behavior was not fit for Parliament?
I don't think I can say that. I think once, let me say this initially, is that I think the problem with the persons who offer themselves for election, they regard their first loyalty is to the party, rather than to the institution of Parliament once they are elected. And I think if we can get to Bahamian people to appreciate that once they're elected, their first loyalty ought to be to the Parliament. You still have a part of the government and the opposition, party-wise, but you have to you have to look at the Parliament as a democratic institution, which is supposed to change lives for the better.
So again, the question becomes: so does then this training, right, come once an individual, say, offers themselves for a nomination, right? Do we say then, hey, I understand that perhaps loyalties lie here, but in that training, perhaps something like the idea that you presented, which is that constitutionally, really, you're representing the interest of a wider people, right?
Let me say this, is that I think when you offer yourself to represent a group of people, you ought to have some accomplishment behind you while you offer yourself to represent me in the House of Assembly. You should have something that you have accomplished in your lifetime. It could be something civic, something community-wise. It could be something professional, but you ought to have some accomplishment. And once you get into the Parliament, I think what Parliament offers is I think, first of all, I think we do a one-day crash session to get you through the opening of Parliament, and then they do the seminar, I think that Mr. Moultrie alluded to.
Yeah.
But the training is not ongoing.
Right.
And so you try to assist members of Parliament by giving them exposure to parliamentary conferences.
Yeah.
Offered.
And those tools can only be had when we're consistently causing for this kind of training. I want to talk about discipline in a moment, but we're going to take our first break here. We will be back with more On the Record after this.
So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, more the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You're watching On the Record. Welcome back. Tonight, our guests are former Speaker of the House of Assembly, Halson Moultrie, and former House of Assembly Clerk Maurice Tynes. Gentlemen, we continue our discussion. Just before the break, I mentioned about disciplinary action, right? What discipline, if any, is there for parliamentarians behaving disorderly during a session?
Well, the Speaker is armed with some issues where he can demand discipline. I think the first.
And that includes removal.
Right? A
Okay.
removal is, to me, it's a discipline in the House is a process. And the first process, the Speaker gets to bring order, should be his word. When the Speaker says, order, I want order in the House, members ought to stop what they're doing, talking or carrying, and observe what the Speaker says. That's the first thing. If that doesn't work, the Speaker then stands. And once he stands, they know everybody has to sit down and everybody has to stop talking. And once the Speaker's on his feet and everyone sit down, he then ought to say, now, when I sit down, I don't want anybody getting up until I recognize someone. The third part, the Speaker can exclude somebody from the House, put them out the House, by them not obeying him. He can do that. Now, the naming of a member of Parliament is a process, and I think that has been missing for some times when it's applied. The naming is when the Speaker has already given you instructions and you disobey the Speaker. The Speaker tells you to take your seat, you would not take your seat. So the Speaker asks you to be named, and the naming ought to be done from the leader of the government house business. Even if it's a member, if it's of his body, he names the person, and the Speaker says you have been named. The Speaker then can put a process for you to be
What could lead to
excluded.
that? What could lead to somebody being named?
When they continually disobey the orders of the Speaker. Yeah,
Or if they continuously breach the rules of procedure. For example, they may heckle another speaker or continuously interrupt another speaker where they do not have a point of order that is clearly indicated in the rules. And so after a period of time, sitting in the chair as the presiding officer, you will see certain patterns begin to develop by certain members. And so you have to try to take charge of that circumstance as quickly as you can. I think one of the greatest challenges that I found in the beginning was that the rules were not well known
Two
to
members
members.
of Parliament.
And some members just didn't intend to abide by the rules. And so you had to enforce the rules. Now, the process of naming, like the former clerk said, is a last resort.
Yeah.
But after you've tried on several occasions to bring order,
Then you move to that.
enforce the rules.
You move to that point.
Then the Speaker can exercise his discretion. The Speaker can name you, or just by an exercise of the Speaker's discretion, can ask you to withdraw.
I want to talk about the sitting Speaker. Actions and style of the current Speaker of the House of Assembly have been openly ridiculed by many, including the former Secretary to the Cabinet, Anita Bernard, who described the Speaker's recent attack on NEMA's director as undignified and crass. Is there a rule in Parliament that prohibits all parliamentarians, inclusive of the Speaker, from attacking citizens in Parliament who are unable to defend themselves there, or is this a privilege that the Speaker has?
There is a rule in the House that should prevent members, a politician, from publicly ridiculing a member of the public. There is a rule.
And that extends to all members of Parliament, correct?
All members, yes, all members of Parliament, and any member of the public. You should not use that position to ridicule a person. You know, I saw that, and I said, the member, the Speaker may have been okay if she had just refer it to NEMA. The NEMA didn't do what it was supposed to do in our view. But once he got us and calls the public servant out publicly, I think that was out of order.
And what did you think as a
Well,
former speaker holding that position before?
There is a rule in place where people can get, let's put it this way, you can get confused between the rule of law and an exception to the rule of law. Parliamentary privilege is an exception to the rule of law. In other words, the ordinary citizen doesn't have the privilege of a sitting member of parliament. For the freedom of speech, they don't have the privilege of certain conduct within the precincts of the parliament. They cannot be brought, a member cannot be brought before the courts for certain matters said, statements made, or their conduct within the precincts of the parliament. But that doesn't give you impunity to unleash. In other words, the convention and the honor that comes with the privilege, it is a convention that is understood that you should not use that opportunity because you are functioning under an exception to the rule of law to attack persons in the public, particularly senior public servants.
So, and of course, many people were offended by the very mannerisms of the speaker. Some say mannerisms include fingernail clipping, head wagging, and as some of us would say, yucking up herself. Is this behavior, in your opinion, complimentary of the office of the Speaker of the House of Assembly?
Well, let me put it this way. I look at it this way.
Or do you think it should be dismissed as
I believe,
just part of her personality?
I believe that what is fundamental and important is the Speaker functioning for the best interests of the development of our democracy. And that is, in my estimation, following Article 72 of the Constitution, ensuring that the Parliament functions in a way to hold the executive branch of the government accountable. What I see people focusing on with respect to the Speaker, what I call superficial matters and mannerisms, and character.
So not consequential in your mind?
Not consequential.
Yeah.
See, if the Speaker was in breach, to the point where the Speaker is functioning to the detriment of good governance or the Parliament itself,
right. That should be the focus. That should be the focus, and not necessarily.
That should be the focus. All of this stuff about the speaker wagging her head and so on.
Yeah.
After a period of time, I can assure you, the Speaker mannerisms and so on will change.
Yeah.
As she settles into the role.
There was also an incident with the Deputy Speaker recently when he attempted to toss the leader of the opposition member for Marco City out of the House. The member for West Grand Bahama and Bimini intervened by asking for a quick recess, and when they returned, the opposition leader and member for Marco City was still in the House. Now, explain the process for the Speaker or Deputy to have someone removed.
Well, let me put it this way. I had several experiences like that. I remember the first incident I had was with the official opposition, when I suspended the official opposition. But I got some calls that night from some very senior and former members of Parliament.
Did you expect that?
I didn't expect the calls from the persons that I got them from, but I welcome. I believe there's wisdom in many counsel. And the persons I respect called me and suggested to me that perhaps Moultrie, instead of acting while you're being challenged, the way you're being challenged by members, perhaps you should suspend for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or find some other reason to have a break so that everyone can cool down before you enforce the rules.
Yeah.
Because the Speaker is free and the Speaker has unfettered discretion at that time. The Speaker is the judge of the High Court of Parliament, and the Speaker can enforce the rules. Persons may not appreciate the manner in which the Speaker enforces the rules, but once the Speaker enforces the rules, you are bound by the decision of the chair.
So let's say now you don't take that route, right? Should the Prime Minister then have a word with them? Or what is the correct procedure? As the Halls of Parliament, some say, should just not be used as a floor for show?
Yeah, if I could answer that,
Yeah.
if I could attempt to answer it, is that I think the leader of the House that day probably saved a lot of problems by suggesting
The leader of government business.
Yeah,
Yes.
government business, by suggesting that suspend. I think a presiding officer should always suspend the House before he makes a decision to put anybody out. And like Ms. Moultrie said, for people to calm down, you'll be surprised to know what 5-minute break could cost.
Yeah.
The Speaker also has the option to calling the persons into his
In essence, taking control of the situation, right?
and speaking with them privately.
Yeah.
And say, you can do better than this, man. You
Yeah.
know?
Well, I want us to talk more about that, but we will take another quick break here and be back with more on the record right after this.
So the project really pays itself back. They
Correct.
set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, and our topic tonight, parliamentary privilege. Let's get back to our discussion, gentlemen. I want to find out from you, Mr. Tynes, do you think, and we've talked about this early on in the show, but do you think a day will come when we see the Speaker's chair as independent in Parliament?
I hope so. I think what I advocate, some of the conventions that have been adopted by the British Parliament, in the UK, once you're elected Speaker, you resign from your party. You don't attend any of the caucuses or conventions or anything. In doing so, you have the freedom and independence to be fair and impartial. And after 5 years, if the House sees you as that, you run unopposed. If you want to run again as Speaker, and you run for your seat, the major parties would not oppose you. And I don't think that could happen over here, but I think we should put it in law.
Why not? Why do you think?
Well, I just think I don't think we get to that appreciation of those conventions. So I think we ought to put it in legislation, put it in law. If you elect a Speaker, or put it in the House rules, if you elect a Speaker, you must resign from your party.
You've been advocating for independence of
Yes.
of the House. Speaker of the House.
I think is an indictment on the deepening and advancement of our democracy to not see the importance of, first of all, the separation of powers among the three branches of government. The Speaker, the Chief Justice, and the Prime Minister are co-equal heads of government. No one from either one of those branches of government should function in more than one branch. And therein lies the challenges in the Bahamas, because the cabinet of the Bahamas believes that it should run the legislative branch of the government. And some, at least all of the staff of the legislative branch of the government are considered members of the cabinet staff. And the cabinet controls the budget of the legislative branch of the government. So we have a fundamental breach of the separation of powers and a fundamental breach of democracy in the Bahamas.
And while you've advocated for that independence, which Mr. Tynes says he doesn't believe will come, right?
Because of immaturity.
And while you've advocated for that, under the former administration which you served in, do you think this administration will visit that idea?
Well, I hope they would take up some of the matters that Mr.
The former speaker.
Moultrie had advocated, and which we advocated for. You know, as the clerk, I couldn't do it openly like Mr. Moultrie could. So ours was done internally. But
how long were you advocating?
Decades. I think I can't think of a speaker that we didn't run this by and got them to believe in it.
The former speaker says immaturity is what really has prevented it. Do you think?
I don't know if it's immaturity so much.
When I say immaturity, it's political immaturity.
Absolutely.
Political immaturity.
Right.
See, let me tell you why I said that. As an attorney at law, I think this is the first time in our parliamentary history where the speaker and the deputy speaker were counsel and attorneys. So we took it upon ourselves because we knew from what we were receiving from cabinet was a delaying process. So we assembled a team of attorneys and we drafted a parliamentary services bill which is complete. We passed it to every member, including the opposition, and there was indication at the time from the cabinet and the prime minister that the government would look at reforming that bill and bringing it forward. And I think in this administration, they brought the court services bill, which is very similar to the parliamentary services bill, so that the judiciary can have its independence and control of its own budget.
Will you continue to advocate, though?
I shall, most certainly. That's my patriotic obligation and commitment to the Bahamas, because democracy cannot function. Being scientifically trained, I can tell you systems produce results.
And Mr. Tynes, do you think you'll join that advocacy, though?
Certainly, I do that. I write letters now about that.
Will you continue the letters?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I think it's a matter of priority, and the Parliament to me is not a priority. I'm talking about the administration of Parliament. It's not a priority to the executive branch. You know, I've written a couple of times showing how the executive branch don't mind spending millions of dollars on office space for themselves, but they and for the judges, but they don't ever do it for the Speaker and the House of Assembly. The buildings that the Parliament occupy now were built in the early 19th century. They're over 200 years old. When they were built for staff of one person. There was no traffic was not a problem then, because the vehicles were probably not around those days.
It was representative of the time.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and you know, so we've passed that time centuries ago, at least a century ago.
But I always say, you know, when I look at the House of Assembly, and the Senate building, and the Hansard building, that if you imagine, you can take yourself back to 1815, 1816, when those edifices were built. They were the greatest structures in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. If you look at them
And
today,
still beautiful structures,
right?
right?
That
Historical
is what the
monuments,
British
really. Yeah.
felt about their parliamentary democracy.
Yeah.
And you see it when you travel into other parts of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, those jurisdictions, you see that the Parliament is the greatest edifice in those nations. But I have to be careful how I say this, right?
You don't have to be careful for now.
And what I've discovered in small black territories, we have this major problem where prime ministers seem to want to diminish the parliament because the parliament is the first arm of the government.
Yes.
And they are answerable to the parliament.
And
So
it's
they,
why-
they diminish the parliament.
And that's why today we discuss it, parliamentary privilege. We're going to take our final break here. Gentlemen, we will be right back with more On the Record right after this.
So the project really pays itself back. They
Correct.
set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Welcome back to On the Record. And gentlemen, no mention of the case, but we have a strange situation in Parliament right now. We've got a sitting member who's been arraigned on a myriad of charges, and there have been public calls for resignation. Is there a rule that says he has to resign?
No, there is no constitution or statutory requirement for him to resign for what he has been charged for. However, I read an editorial where they said that there's no convention in the Bahamas for a member to resign if charged. You're not convicted yet, but you're charged. But my response to that is there is a Westminster Convention which we follow, which I think demands that the member, if he's charged criminally in the court, he ought to resign. How can a person who is before the courts on a criminal matter carry out his requirements to his constituents and to his political party in the House? You know, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to remain there, and I think it's going to be very difficult for the leader of the opposition to have him remain.
Well,
Your thoughts,
I think the
former
member
Speaker.
for Long Island situation is fertile ground for a discussion on education on the entire process. I believe that the member is not required. I know that he's not required by law or by the Constitution to resign. But I think more fundamentally, I see the breakdown in the system is producing this result. For example, if the Public Accounts Committee would function in the Parliament, Parliament can regulate itself as well as its members. They would have been able to do their proper investigations so that members of Parliament will know that they are under scrutiny They are being monitored. They can be summoned and brought and required to bring documents at any given point in time
And then can
during
be
their
guided as
tenure.
such, right?
And so before we get 5 years later, and you have to go to the court, the third arm of the government, for a remedy, the system, there's a mechanism in the parliament for dealing with that system. And that was fundamentally flawed to the point where when I started Speaker, the Public Accounts Committee never met, not once. Wow. Even though the Speaker, I overruled a previous decision which suggested that the Public Accounts Committee was only able to review documents that were tabled and audited by the Auditor General, which is totally, well, that was first of all, that was an opinion from the Attorney General Office, which is the attorney for the executive branch of the government. The Speaker should never be taking any legal advice from the Attorney General. Not that the Attorney General is not competent and not able to provide legal advice, but the Attorney General is the executive branch attorney. So, we had a circumstance where, as in Mr. Gibson's case, what happened to Mr. Gibson ought not to have happened. In other words,
What do you mean exactly?
ought not to have happened. Mr. Gibson should have been brought before the Public Accounts Committee, demanded by summons to produce evidence that is now before the courts, and the Parliament, after the Parliament has scrutinized the process, the Parliament can make a decision and pass that matter on, because we always want to avoid a situation where, by the fiat of the Attorney General Office.
Yeah.
Mr. Tynes,
Hold on, let me finish a minute. So the fiat of the Attorney General Office, who's a part of the executive branch, can then bring charges or instruct the police to follow certain guidelines and bring charges against any member of Parliament. We don't want to risk in a corrupt, we are calling ourselves a corrupt environment. One government calls the other opposition corrupt, and the opposition calls the government corrupt. So if we accept their position, we accept that we're working in a corrupt environment. You don't want to use the judiciary that way.
I just want to verify something. Can you verify, Mr. Tynes, if Mr. Gibson is convicted and sentenced to more than 12 months in prison, then he is forced to resign?
I forget what the law, what the Constitution says. I think you have to be under a sentence of death or imprisonment for over a certain period of time, or you have to be convicted of an electoral crime. And you can't. See, I think the Constitution only talks about qualifications, mostly about qualifications to run for the House. It doesn't speak too much of while you're in the House. But let me get back to Mr. Moultrie's position. I think it would have been very difficult for the Public Accounts Committee to have been on this case while, during the last session. Because all you had at that time were allegations made by certain people in the press. And I don't know if the Public Accounts Committee ought to be moving on just public allegations made in the press. Because if we do that, the Public Accounts Committee be all over the place, trying to, to listen to this person, that person. I think there has to
becomes prejudiced.
Yeah, I think the rules of the House requires the Public Accounts Committee to look into. They can look into reports that have been tabled. Now there's a discussion of whether or not that ought to be like that. You see, in Britain, I know the argument has been made that in Britain, the Public Accounts Committee could look into anything, but we have to remember that in Britain, the Parliament is supreme. The Parliament is not supreme in the Bahamas. Our Constitution is supreme. So in Britain,
So by virtue of that, the systems operate differently.
well, or
But-
different
but-
levels.
To an
Yeah.
extent.
Our Constitution is supreme. And our Constitution, under Article 55, gives the Parliament the power under the Constitution to regulate itself
Yeah.
and to put rules and procedure into place.
So with that said, let me wrap on this. Does he get to make contributions as he did in the past and participate as normal?
He's a member of
Or-
Parliament.
Yeah.
He
So
continues,
there is no censorship
he continues to be a
because
member
of
of
what
Parliament.
he's
No,
facing.
No.
See, the first step in this whole process is to always remember constitutionally, everyone is presumed innocent
Until proven
proven
guilty.
guilty. Why should a person who is presumed innocent have to step down or resign their seat?
If he's convicted, then what? Is there an automatic mandate for a
Well,
by-election?
No. The seat has to be vacated before there is a call for a by-election.
Perhaps that's where the calls for resignation comes from?
Let me tell you why so the system is broken down. Article 49 of the Constitution gives the Parliament the power constitutionally to determine whether a member should vacate his seat if he has an interest in a government contract. Now, most of the allegations brought against the member for Long Island falls under that category. But because the matter has been brought before the courts now, that entire process under Article 49 of the Constitution that the Parliament should have exercised its authority under will now be prejudicial if the Parliament tries to intervene that way. That is why I say, if you follow the Constitution, the Parliament should have taken the opportunity, and I absolutely, totally disagree, that the Public Accounts Committee has to wait for documents and audited reports to be tabled. Let me tell you why. If the Auditor General decides to withhold a report, it'll never be tabled. If the Speaker decides when he receives the report from the Auditor General not to table it or to bring it to the attention of the government leader of business, the report will not be tabled. That would circumvent the entire process.
So, Mr. Tynes, to that, what do you say?
No, I can't see a committee of the Parliament going, meeting and investigating claims that are just in the press, just allegations.
But I don't think the leader of the opposition, who is the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, would intervene and call the Public Accounts Committee to act and to investigate on pure speculations, especially the former leader of the opposition, who is now Prime Minister, is a QC. He would not introduce or initiate under the Public Accounts Committee frivolous and vexatious, scandalous proceedings. This is what I'm saying.
And I think more questions about this process are going to continue in the months, certain weeks and months to come. And we will certainly continue to discuss this entire process and the way this looks moving forward. But I want to also find out from you both. Allegedly, Gibson and his co-accused were shackled hands to feet. Is there no privilege in this regard for a sitting parliamentarian, especially given the fact that he was accused of white-collar crimes and poses no real threat of violence? Is there any privilege there?
Parliamentary privilege.
Yeah.
Parliamentary people privilege don't go to the point of criminal charges. The only thing it says about criminal charges is that a person who's charged with criminal matters the police can't come in the House of Assembly and arrest them without the permission of the Speaker.
But it also says in the Powers and Privileges Senate and House of Assembly Act, where the immunities of members are defined and delineated, and I think it's provision 4 through 6, that a member on his way to Parliament
Cannot.
cannot be arrested. Now, how can you justify to me that in the middle of the budget, when the Parliament meets sometimes until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, you are arresting a member of Parliament, detaining them, preventing them? See, because Bahamians need to understand what's going on here. See, in the magistrate court system, all magistrates know if you are arraigning a person and you're bringing over 100 charges, you better start that process like 8 a.m. if you want to get that finished before 4 p.m. so that someone can arrange their bail.
But do you think then that there was some intentionality there? That there may
It is apparent. It is apparent that much more is happening than is meeting the eye because the process is being breached.
Gibson's case, now prejudiced, it seems, with all the social media posts presuming his guilt. Do you think that is the case? Well, let me ask it again. Is Gibson's case now prejudiced with all the social media posts presuming his guilt?
Well, I don't know if that is any different from when the other three members who were in the cabinet or in the PLP were charged. You had the same thing happening. I don't think
but he's a sitting member of Parliament, right?
That's
in the
a
other
significant distinguishing
in the other instance, the members that were charged were not sitting members.
No, I'm talking about the social media part of it.
Okay.
You can't.
Yes.
There's no control of that. So I don't think that I don't think the courts could even take that into consideration because we haven't put any laws in place to regulate the social media. I don't know if Mr. Gibson was. I don't know. I have a problem with people being shackled going to court in any case, unless the person really was a very, very violent, and did some very violent stuff, and he may have some associates out there who may try to free him. But the process of taking people to court, I think, could be done more humanely anyhow, without I heard that the police do it to embarrass these people, because it's a badge of honor for police to be seen walking a shackled person to court. I don't know where that comes from, but in Mr. Gibson's case, the public accounts. I disagree with Mr. Moultrie. I don't think the Public Accounts Committee could have saved him.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that. Hold on. Make sure that don't get on the record.
No,
I'm not suggesting that the Public Accounts Committee could have saved him. What I'm saying is a procedure and process involving the Parliament could have been undertaken from after year 1 or year 2.
Which goes to the point about the function of Parliament being actually utilized. Right?
Exactly.
Listen, we are out of time. There is so much more for us to discuss, and the questions that I have are many. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for On the Record tonight. That's going to do it for us. We want to thank you for joining us, and to you, all the best. Our topic tonight was parliamentary privilege, and our guests were former Speaker of the House of Assembly, Halson Moultrie, and former House of Assembly Clerk, Maurice Tynes. Join us again next week with another topic that directly affects the lives of Bahamians. And until then, I'm Kendeno, Knowles, filling in for Jerome Sawyer. See you soon.